Welcome back, YouTube. This is part 2 of a video series talking about the reasoning and history behind what you could consider Nintendo's anti-consumer choices in the video game industry. So in part 1 of the series, I explained the concept of an economic moat, and I discussed how stringent intellectual property enforcement, as well as home console sales, make up the bulk of Nintendo's moat, and how this puts it at odds with the way the industry has evolved over the past decade. I also went into detail about why I think Nintendo won't make its older franchises more widely available. Again, counter to the way the industry has been evolving. If you want to see part 1, there should be an icon up in the corner of the video, or check the description. You'll see that I go into more detail about these topics, as well as what constitutes an anti-consumer company. In this second part of the series, I'm going to provide some historical examples of Nintendo's draconian IP enforcement, and how it's wielded its intellectual property to the detriment of its fans, its customers, just to illustrate historically how anti-consumer or anti-fandom Nintendo has always been from the get-go. So let's take a trip down memory lane and illustrate how Nintendo's resistance to emerging technologies and fears of IP infringement actively shortchanged really anybody who's ever loved the Nintendo product. Without further ado, let's jump right into talking about this. So my first example is a oldie but a goodie. I've talked a ton about how Nintendo has attempted to kill video game rentals in previous videos. I've alluded to it. Nearly all my knowledge of this subject comes from the excellent video by Video Game Historian, so please go watch his video for more context and really a more in-depth look at this issue. So for those of you who are watching this in the far future, or for those of you who weren't born in the 80s, early 90s, once upon a time, games, movies, music, pretty much any media existed on physical analog mediums of storage. Back in the day, there used to be devices like cartridges, tapes, and because there was no internet, at least not in any way that's recognizable in some modern sense, there was no digital downloads. But more importantly, there was really no way for you to know what kind of game you were buying until you'd open it up and played it. This is because video game sites and YouTube didn't exist. And that's why the first game I ever owned was A Bug's Life on Game Boy Color. And boy, was that game freaking... And so help me God if I find the guy that convinced me to waste my allowance on a game for a movie I never watched. I swear I will... Anyway, so there were things like review magazines, such as Nintendo Power, which if you were fortunate enough to subscribe to and fortunate enough to have received the latest issue before making a video game purchase, you could make a somewhat informed decision. But in the past, people buying games, especially at launch, might have not really had a full idea of what they're getting into. That's not really true today unless the game studio who's selling a game to you is outright lying to you.
This city's always got a promise for you. Might be a lie, an illusion.
This is why the introduction of video game rentals from video stores like Blockbuster in the late 80s was a big deal. For gamers, this was a win, of course, because the average NES game was about $40, which in today's money is almost $90. For under $5 back in the day, you could try out a game over the weekend, something like that, and evaluate it firsthand. Although I wasn't born in the 80s, even I benefited from game rentals in the late 90s and early 2000s on the N64 and GameCube. But if Nintendo had its way back in the late 80s, this practice would have been outlawed. Very early on, Nintendo was keen on destroying the video game rental market, first by lobbying Congress and sponsoring legislation in the US that would limit the titles that could be rented from video stores. When these efforts failed, Nintendo decided to actually sue Blockbuster in court. Now, why Blockbuster? It was the largest video game store at the time, and well, it never really shrank until the industry collapsed. So, for all intents and purposes, Blockbuster was, from the beginning and until the end, synonymous with the very concept of renting videos, despite it being only just one brand in this large industry. Nintendo ended up asking for an injunction against Blockbuster on the basis that every game rental included an instruction manual, which they claimed was copyright material, and so including manuals in game rentals was considered, in Nintendo's eyes, copyright infringement. Yes, that's right. The act of renting out a game as it was bought was perfectly legal in Nintendo's eyes, but if you included an instruction booklet that came with the game, so help you God, Mario will come after you like the freaking mafia. In reality, Nintendo really just wanted to stop the rental of games, but had no legal recourse to do so. As much as Nintendo hated the idea of losing money to consumers, who would rather rent a game than buy one, their frustration didn't make a legal argument. We know this is actually what Nintendo wanted because of comments like the colorful one made by Howard Lincoln, former VP and chairman of Nintendo of America. Since this channel is never going to be monetized, I've highlighted keywords of interest. Look very closely. Now, to be fair, the only citation I could find for this quote is in a 1993 book called Game Over, How Nintendo Zapped an American Industry, Captured Your Dollars, and Enslaved Your Children. I'll leave it up to you to decide if that title is clickbait. To be fair, despite the insane title, this book is considered one of the preliminary sources of information for the early video game industry. Despite the hyperbolic title, this book is genuinely considered a wealth of video game industry history. David Sheff, the author who spoke firsthand with many of the sources involved with Nintendo's early days, including Lincoln, who I'm assuming had Sleff murdered shortly after talking to him because, honestly, some of the quotes from Lincoln in this book make him sound like a mafioso himself. I mean, look at this other quote from Lincoln. "You have no idea what you're taking on. A tiger who will skin you piece by piece." The 1999 revision of this book can be found on the Internet Archive. I'll include a link in the description. So anyway, even without Lincoln's quote on video game rentals, Nintendo's actions speak louder than words. Intimidating video game stores that sold in bulk to customers who presumably were rental shops, for example, was one thing that they did in Japan. Lobbying Congress in America to upend the nascent industry of video game rentals before it took off. These are the things that Nintendo pursued over the course of several years. And was it the end of the world when Nintendo was forced to allow video game rentals to exist? No, it wasn't. In fact, in the years to follow, it seems like Blockbuster would have a very good relationship with Nintendo, being allowed to release exclusive SNES and N64 games that really couldn't be found anywhere. And that now sell for thousands of dollars nowadays. So, if anything, Nintendo conspired with Blockbuster to make games even harder to find. Geez, thanks Nintendo, so much for Blockbuster abusing your copyright, am I right? So moving on to our second example, we've got another story that comes to us from what you could consider the ancient past. You can also learn more about the topic we're about to talk about via gaming historian, who I mentioned in the previous entry. So, in May of 1990, Nintendo took toymaker Galoob to court for the device known as the Game Genie. For those of you who don't know, back in the day, we used hardware to modify games in order to help us cheat, usually in single-player games. The Game Genie is before my time, but I grew up with the Game Shark for Game Boy systems, and the Action Replay, which lots of consoles, including the GameCube and the DS, use. I don't really know what upset Nintendo about the Game Genie, because it literally didn't harm anybody. Keep in mind, this is long before online games were a thing, local multiplayer games were rare, and they allowed for a max of, say, 2 players at this time, in the era of NES. This is also long before saving was really common in the games. For older games like Mega Man, the early Mega Man games, you had to use long, complex passwords that you'd receive once you reached specific points in the game. In order to quote-unquote save your progress. And that was if the game was generous. In many cases, you'd actually have to start games over once you lost, without any passcode system to help you save progression. Cheat devices like the Game Genie allowed you to bypass this by either giving you ungodly advantages to speed through any levels that you played before, or arbitrarily allowing you to load a game from any level. My assumption is that Nintendo wanted to control how people played games back then. It's not really clear that this is actually the main reason. We have really a variety of quotes from Nintendo of America mafioso Howard Lincoln that express a wide variety of sentiment. So in one statement given to the Washington Post in June of 1990, Lincoln says, "Galoob's product directly compromises the depth of play and challenge of Nintendo games. Using Game Genie, Nintendo games, which now take hours to master can be mastered in a matter of minutes without any skill whatsoever. So here we have Lincoln concerned with cheating. It's decades before Ubisoft bloat would be invented, but perhaps Nintendo cared about a metric known as total playtime or playtime retention. The reason why many modern games today are longer is because game developers like Ubisoft are trying to maximize the amount of time players are playing games, which allows for the product to have a higher or longer retention time. But in a world where the Game Genie lets any player see all the content in the game in a matter of minutes, this would destroy any semblance of these metrics, assuming that Nintendo cared about them back in 1989. In court, Lincoln's legal argument could be summed up using the following quote: U.S. copyright law prevents third parties from creating and marketing derivatives of copyrighted video games without the express consent of the game's owner. So here, the expressed worry was, as far as I could tell, that the Game Genie would allow ROM hacking. Now, mind you, the term ROM hacking was not used by Lincoln, as emulation was still years away, but the idea of derivative works as expressed here indicates that Nintendo apparently feared that the Game Genie could create an alternate market of modified games that used Nintendo's IP. I don't know how or why they thought this was the case, but clearly they were wrong, which is why they lost the court case. The Game Genie cannot create new code, it just rearranges what's on the NES cartridges. This makes the Game Genie a complementary good or a complementary device, not a substitutional device, to NES games. The legal brief for the case even states as such. Some time ago, for example, computer companies began marketing spell checkers that operate within existing word processors by signaling the writer when a word was misspelled. These applications, as well as countless others, could not be produced and marketed if courts were to conclude that a word processor and spell checker combination is a derivative work based on the word processor alone. The Game Genie is useless by itself. It can only enhance and it cannot duplicate or recast a Nintendo game's output. It does not contain or produce a Nintendo game's output in some concrete or permanent form, nor does it supplant demand for Nintendo game cartridges. Such innovations will rarely constitute infringing derivative works under the Copyright Act. So this is speculation, but that's why I maintain the Game Genie case is really similar to the Blockbuster case. Nintendo sued Blockbuster for renting their games with their instruction manuals when their real intent was to scare video game stores from renting video games at all. So here, what I suspect is that Nintendo either wanted a cut of Game Genie sales, and they didn't get it, or they were concerned that NES player retention and playtime were going to be impacted by the Game Genie. Either way, this is another illustration of the extent to which Nintendo wields its IP in order to affect the choices customers have. So now we're going to move to something more modern, possibly something that has affected some of you directly, taking place in the aughts and 2010s. There are some other late 80s stuff and 90s stuff I can go over to illustrate the idea of Nintendo's Moat. For example, there was this time Nintendo had to settle with the FTC over charges of price fixing. But let's talk about something that's more recent. It's no secret that Nintendo has a turbulent history with the modern esports scene, despite itself creating the precursor to modern esports in the form of the Nintendo World Championships back in the 90s. Nintendo, to the best of my knowledge, is the only gaming company that has the dubious distinction of attempting to remove its games from multiple tournaments, if not threatening to shut down entire events. So most recently, we have the Big House incident, which happened in 2020, but some others include EVO 2013, which would have been prevented from streaming if not for the huge backlash the Smash community expressed. Additionally, the entire history of Smash, generally speaking, at MLG, which is one of the oldest and largest esports circuits, is pretty tenuous. Smash Bros. Brawl, for example, was prevented from being hosted at least twice, once in 2014 and 2010. One of the reasons cited for Smash Bros. On-again, off-again presence at MLG was Nintendo's difficulty as a partner. Long-running franchises, for example, like Street Fighter, have not really faced this issue, with games like Street Fighter 2 remaining one of the top events at EVO nearly a decade after its initial release. Even for competitive communities that Nintendo doesn't seem outright hostile to, like Splatoon and ARMS, fans, especially fans who are outside of Japan, have pointed out that the company's support has been half-hearted at best. For a company like Nintendo, who invented the spectacle of televised esports via the Nintendo World Championship, there's a very, very weird thing going on. What is happening here? In this instance, I think we have two issues at play. The first issue, as demonstrated in the earliest days of the Smash community, was that Nintendo probably wanted to maintain exclusive rights to stream content, even if it had no intention of ever doing so. It was really only after seeing the high demand for such content that it kind of took a step back and capitulated to demand. The second issue here is that Nintendo has very strong incentives to keep competitive communities at arm's length due to their brand as a casual, friendly, entry-level, and family-friendly gaming company. This is something I talked about in one of my earlier videos with my friend E. I can link to that video in the description and above in the icon. But Nintendo first and foremost prioritizes these aspects of its branding, and there could be concern within the company that if it leans too aggressively into esports, that this could detract from its image. The other thing is, communities like esports communities can be toxic. There were, for example, the numerous sexual assault allegations within the Smash Bros. Community, and these things would be harder to deal with if Nintendo actually had a more direct relationship in coordinating and supporting events. Nintendo is far enough removed from many of the competitive scenes around its franchises that this is not a problem, and I think that's something that Nintendo is happy to keep this way. So I'm neither defending nor criticizing Nintendo here. I'm just stating what its incentives for its actions are. But is any of this behavior anti-consumer is a good question to ask. It's worth pointing out that in nearly every behavior I've discussed in this series, Nintendo was well within its rights to practice, even those that resulted in court cases that it lost. For example, in the Blockbuster case, Blockbuster had to settle with Nintendo based on the narrow way that Nintendo defined infringement in that court case. However, I'm including this esports assessment here because it's a pretty good illustration of the actions that discourage or invalidate Nintendo's fandom by limiting how fans can enjoy and express themselves. When compared to other developers and publishers, Nintendo has the most restrictive reactions to how its community can engage with its IP. And so finally, we move on to our last example involving game streaming and Let's Plays. There's some ground rules or basic points that I want to make before talking about this to make sure we're all on the same page. First, I know that fair use is not a defense for streaming and Let's Plays. The default assumption, especially back in the earliest days of YouTube, was that these activities were actually copyright infringement. So LPs and streams to this day exist in a gray area, which I was surprised to learn. This gray area has been defined by legal scholar and now Biden administration member Timothy Wu as tolerated use. That's to say, companies could choose to exercise their copyright, but many opt not to. This is either because there are indirect benefits to the behaviors that are in question, like free publicity from Let's Plays, or because it's more trouble than it's worth to enforce copyright in these cases. Sometimes copyright holders, such as developers, provide guidelines that grant users the ability to stream or Let's Play freely, so long as the fans doing so follow specific conditions. That's in effect what the Nintendo Partnership Program was. If you want to learn more about how I came to this understanding, I'll have some links in the video description. So, if Nintendo was within its right to exercise its copyright in this way, what's the problem? How exactly is this anti-consumer? So, as I said in the first part of this series, one of the heuristics or rules of thumb that gets my anti-consumer sense tingling is whether or not other companies engage in the same behavior in order to protect their market share. This is actually one of the more important rules of thumb I use in my analysis because it allows me to avoid talking about seemingly every anti-competitive or anti-consumer thing Nintendo has done or has been accused of doing. For example, I mentioned this in the first video, in the earliest days of Nintendo, one of the questions that was litigated, both in court and via public opinion, was the idea of console exclusivity and the extent to which Nintendo exerted vertical control on the developers it worked with. I didn't include this discussion here in this video because for much of the modern video game market history, console exclusivity was a cornerstone of the market and wasn't something that was unique to Nintendo. In fact, the Big N's argument, back when it was the only major player in the home console market, was that all of its practices were to maintain quality control. This was a compelling argument because a few years prior to the NES's launch, the video game market crashed, even if, as detractors pointed out back then, the home software market didn't have such practices, and that the home software market would have been worse off if hardware manufacturers could limit where software could be installed. There were some important distinctions for the customer as to why a home console manufacturer like Nintendo might want greater control over their ecosystem when compared to another hardware manufacturer, especially as a new company entering a new market that had just crashed. So I'm not pointing this out to convince you that I'm some objective source on all things anti-consumer, but so that you at least understand my reasoning here. So to be fair, I think that this behavior of being anti-streaming and anti-let's play is more of an anti-fandom behavior more so than an anti-consumer behavior. Actions like this, or C&Ding fan projects and shutting down esports tournaments, they don't monetarily shortchange people who've purchased Nintendo products, right? I could still enjoy my video games from Nintendo. Like, if Nintendo shuts down Evo, it doesn't necessarily affect the quality of my experience as someone who's bought Super Smash Bros. So it could be argued that many of the things I'm talking about in this video, like the aggressive stances on Let's Plays and esports tournaments, that these things are technically not anti-consumer because they don't monetarily harm customers. However, I think this analysis of anti-consumer behavior still works for stuff like this because the issue I'm pointing out here is mainly that while the implication of Nintendo's action seems to be that it's to protect their market share, to protect their brand through IP enforcement, there's a legal argument that says that if you don't defend your copyright, that you effectively lose it. You could see that its competitors in the industry don't behave this way. To give you an extreme example, consider that back in 2003, Microsoft Bungie, the original entity that made Halo, allowed Rooster Teeth to create Red vs. Blue royalty-free. No courtrooms, no licensing fees, nothing. RVB has gone from a fan project to a media behemoth in its own right, with its own book deals and streaming deals. I'm bringing up this example not to say that Nintendo must permissibly allow any and every single use of its IP in order to be a good company, right? But to suggest that maybe there's a happy medium between what Microsoft Bungie did and lawyering up against some no-name developer for a fan game distributed to 5 people. So going back to this example of streaming and Let's Plays, was the Nintendo Creators Program anti-consumer, or rather, I should say anti-fandom, and why? Well, by the company's own admission, yes, this program seems to have been. That's why Nintendo caved in and quietly discontinued it back in 2018. As one of my favorite comments in response to this story states, "Welcome to 2006, Nintendo." While Nintendo was far from the only company to have an eyebrow-raising response to streaming and Let's Plays, it's perhaps one of the most draconian and over-the-top responses we've seen to this issue. A response that it maintained well beyond the point where most companies had already ceased to pursue direct control over the Let's Play ecosystem. So for those of you who don't know or remember just how insane the Nintendo Creators Program was, the Creators Program effectively required Nintendo to manually approve any video that YouTube flagged through its Content ID system as containing any mention or inclusion of modern Nintendo products. By modern, I just mean anything post-GameCube, basically. One of the silver linings, I guess, is that approved videos granted YouTubers up to a 30-70 ad revenue split with Nintendo if they registered their entire channel. But this required, again, having each and every single video that you produced approved by Nintendo. And for someone who, for example, wasn't a Nintendo exclusive channel, this could be very, very messy. This would limit what games people could play or talk about on their channel. Admittedly, this is better than the previous status quo with Nintendo wholesale taking up all the ad revenue in most cases, or just simply wiping out channels from existence. But Nintendo becoming the middleman here was ultimately a really inefficient system, which resulted in YouTubers not receiving payments up front or delays in payment when videos went up. While the issue of Let's Plays and tolerated use is pretty thorny, I don't want to simplify the issue. Nintendo at the time, and really ever since, had one of the most unprecedented responses to the YouTube ecosystem. I almost think it would have been better and less controversial for Nintendo to just continue taking all the ad revenue from the videos. At least that way, they could have avoided problems like being in the position of approving or denying video game reviews about Nintendo products, for example, or being accused of shaping what people can say about the company online. As someone who did play Nintendo games but wasn't a monetized channel, it was an issue that didn't affect me personally, but I always thought it was pretty messed up, especially back in 2015 when the program was introduced. Developers and companies at this point, including freaking Microsoft, effectively did not care what you uploaded to YouTube about their games for the most part. But this anxiety and desire for control isn't that surprising coming from Nintendo. And from what I know, most major YouTubers and people who were more casually interested in Let's Plays and streaming just avoided Nintendo games because of this. Nintendo essentially ended up increasing their overhead trying to extract pennies from their fan base. As one of the oldest publishers in the industry, again, I go back to this point, the company had a very powerful opportunity to show everyone how to adapt to new technologies and embrace new technologies as a way to build your brand. But instead, Nintendo insisted on being the Scrooge of the gaming industry and implemented a program that by its own metrics failed while pissing off its fan base. So those are my 4 examples that illustrate that Nintendo has always been out of touch when it comes to being a pro-consumer company and when it comes to making decisions that are, good for its fans and its customers. And honestly, these decisions that they've made are pretty baffling in a world where adopting new technologies and adopting to new fandoms like esports and streaming could have made the company a lot of money, honestly. I think it's literally impossible for Nintendo to burn through its goodwill given its history in the gaming industry, but if the company were to ease up on how it enforces its moat, I think it could be even in a better position. With that said, I'm debating whether or not I want to do a part 3 where I'll talk more broadly about the trends that I think will put pressure on Nintendo and Nintendo's moat. Let me know in the comments if you think that would be interesting. But anyway, this is the conclusion to what is part 2 of me discussing Nintendo's moat and Nintendo's history as a anti-consumer company. Anyway, take care, YouTube. Mikamu out. I'm not really happy.